In our studies, which we will continue again next Friday, I have undertaken to give as comprehensive a view as possible, firstly, of the human being's connection with the whole universe, the cosmos, both the physical and spiritual cosmos, and secondly, to show how spiritual scientific study can gradually enable us to create a bridge between what we call the natural order and the moral spiritual world order. My talk today will be a kind of interlude in which we examine how the spirit in the human being himself must be regarded as bound up with the physical body if we are to come to an holistic view of human development. You see, what prevents people from building a bridge between spirit and matter in their view of the universe also prevents a traditional worldview, in its diverse forms, from seeing the totality of factors active in human development. The science of the spirit is not an abstract theory, a sum of ideas only, with which to resolve the abstract question of our eternal nature, of successive lives on earth. We cannot make any headway with a spiritual science of this kind, and would misunderstand it if we were to do so. Instead, we must see the science of the spirit as pervading life itself, and must gradually succeed in applying to life, in a very specific and tangible way, what is initially inevitably presented by this spiritual science in a somewhat abstract or theoretical manner. I would first like to give you an example, taken from actual spiritual scientific research, which one can, to begin with, only present in words, but which subsequently can also be verified in life itself. It is like this. Certain contexts and circumstances become apparent to the spiritual researcher, and he formulates them in words and also applies them to life. Every person can observe the outward course of life. An unprejudiced view of life will then discover confirmation of what the spiritual researcher has perceived through his seership. This is roughly what must happen with an example of spiritual scientific insight, such as the one I now wish to present. The modern view of history is very strongly influenced by what we can call the scientific mode of thinking. Historical studies have, in a sense, gradually capitulated to a scientific outlook, so that humanity's historical development is regarded in terms of effects whose causes can be traced, a causal connection that reflects ideas of cause and effect in science. While historical studies only demonstrate this trend in radical form in a few isolated instances, history has increasingly shown a tendency to approximate to a methodology similar to that employed in science. Especially when we consider how daily life is developed, and how individuals are embedded in this context of humanity's development through generations, we increasingly tend to see things in merely external ways, as if guided by something like scientific necessity. Today, many people feel burdened by the thought that our human qualities must be attributed to physical inheritance, and yet they also consider this a necessary insight. The whole thrust of modern discourse is that human characteristics of either a more bodily or psychological kind are physically inherited, and in turn we overlay history with this ubiquitous paradigm. We consider how we ourselves live in the present generation, how this originates in previous generations, and these in turn from preceding ones, and we accustom ourselves to regarding history in terms of this succession of generations. If we take any region of the earth, let's say Central Europe, we can study the nature and characteristics of its population over recent decades, and then look back to earlier decades and try to trace the characteristics of, say, modern Germans or French people back to German and French people in the 18th century. This is undertaken, as far as possible, in an accustomed mode of logical inquiry, a satisfyingly linear account of humanity's development. Scientists would say that the need for a causal explanation is satisfied here, if we can trace qualities of soul and spirit in a particular type of modern human being back to corresponding qualities of earlier generations of the same nation, race, and so forth. This offers a certain causal mode of understanding in a linear flow of time. And it is quite understandable, in fact, that a worldview such as the one that has developed over the last 300 or 400 years, and even further back, which, despite being informed by a religious and spiritualistic emphasis, makes soul and spirit closely dependent on physical reality the moment it departs from abstraction, is unable to get beyond this mode of seeing, this reliance on a merely generational sequence of development. But this is precisely where we must give serious credence to our anthroposophic insights. From this perspective, we must not only consider the human being or a number of modern people, insofar as they have inherited characteristics from an immediately preceding generation, but must instead be clear that every individual bears within him a soul and spirit that spent a long period in the world of soul and spirit before he entered his physical body. And so when we have a person alive today before us, we have to see both aspects. Yes, he is physically present and bears characteristics inherited from former generations. But we also see his soul's spiritual nature. He bears a soul within him, which initially has nothing in common with immediately preceding generations, nor much to do with earlier generations developing on earth in a long-gone era. A soul, therefore, that had no direct connection with the earthly evolution that unfolded while this succession of generations passed, since it then lived in the world of spirit and soul. It is just one-sided to see the human being in terms only of inherited characteristics passed on through generations. In fact, in the end, it is merely illusion to see humankind and history in this way. People persuade themselves that they understand life, but in fact they do not at all. They simply theorize that individuals' behavior and a way of being is due to inherited characteristics. But if they had a more open mind, they would discover countless instances where what they assume to be physical traits passed on through generations has no bearing whatever on some situations today, either as regards a particular individual or the nature of a whole race or nation. A true view of reality will not be content with such an abstraction, which is still abstract even if materialistic, but will instead observe that what comes to expression in the present must be explained not only by genetically inherited qualities, but also by what lies in the powers of souls who lived a long time in the world of spirit before they descended to reincarnation in their present bodies. Over the years, I have hinted that in our time, especially prior to the catastrophic events of the First World War, the population mix of Europe included people who bear within them souls from the early Christian era. The world is a complex place, and in saying such things, one is always stating only a partial truth. To approach the whole truth of things, such statements repeatedly have to be broadened to include further aspects. Please don't imagine that I am trying to correct something I said in the past. What I said then was entirely accurate, though it relates to only a percentage of people. Nevertheless, it needs enlarging with the following perspective. A relatively small proportion of the population of Central Europe bear within them souls who lived during these early centuries of Christianity, a period which we picture as described by our ordinary history, Actually, things are far more complex. Spiritual scientific inquiry discovers something that will, in many respects, seem paradoxical. And yet, in spiritual scientific investigation, insights must be gained through true spiritual perception, supersensible experience, whereas mere speculation of a philosophical or other kind usually gives rise to one error after another. Realities discovered through spiritual experience always appear different. And this is something the spiritual investigator feels so intensely that he himself is surprised by his findings. He does not initially expect to discover a particular thing, but is surprised by what he discovers. To present a few such findings to you, I now want to turn your attention to the population living in America at the time when Europeans began their lengthy conquest of the Americas. Civilized Europe regarded this population, of course, as wild and untutored. Yet while this indigenous population was wild, perhaps by comparison to what had come to be known as civilization in Europe in recent centuries, it often possessed other non-intellectual powers of soul which so-called civilized people might wish they could regain. In this Native American population, there lived, above all, a vision of spiritual powers at work in the world, which on closer inspection has striking qualities. These people worshipped the Great Spirit. At the time of the European conquest, though, their religion had fallen into decline. And yet even this decadent form of it points back to the worship of a Great Spirit who pervades and weaves through all existence, and to whom the various elemental spirits are subordinate. This pantheistic religion was alive amongst the American Indian population. But there is one thing above all others that we need to remember. These peoples of America had had no share in the experiences undergone by Europeans during the period we think of as Christian history. Generations of these Native Americans had been untouched by what Christianity brought to the people of Europe. The souls of Native Americans were entirely constituted in a way that enabled them to develop intensely pantheistic feelings, and likewise to act out of impulses connected with these feelings. This meant, though, that their souls could spend only a relatively short time in the world, between death and a new birth. The intense but extremely simple elemental experiences of these souls required no long assimilation in the world of spirit. And so almost all the souls of the Native Americans who were living at the time of the first conquests of Europeans, as well as souls who lived there later, have now returned already and largely reincarnated amongst the population of Western Europe. Thus we can trace back the generations from today to the medieval period, and we find physically inherited characteristics. But if we consider this to be the whole truth, we are harboring illusions. It is abstract to think that the current population of Western Europe, much of Central Europe, and even wide tracts of Eastern Europe have acquired their qualities merely through genetic inheritance. Besides this generational legacy, the blood of forefathers within them, Western souls have also entered the majority of these bodies. And these souls are ones whose inner development had not yet been colored by the Christian impulse, but who largely bore a pantheistic impulse within them. In the very first months of their upbringing, in these new cultural surroundings, for you see, outer culture, and not the soul's inner impulses, does reproduce in a linear way through the generations, these people appropriated Christianity externally. They were externally shaped into the nature they present to us today, which is often the only thing we perceive. And yet if we have an open mind and really study people closely, really scrutinizing their character with a penetrating gaze, we can discover a quality pulsing in them that arrived along with their souls. As I said, things discovered by spiritual scientific inquiry are often paradoxical and cannot be deduced by speculation. Actual experience, using methods I have often described to you in lectures and writings, must produce such findings. But they can be outwardly verified, and if you do this, you will find that such insights shed light on the external world. We find that there were people living in Europe at the time history usually refers to as the migration period, who migrated from there. The souls of these people were similar to those who adopted Christianity as it spread from the south in a northerly direction. In other words, souls who grew into an outward Christianization of culture. These souls who adopted a European Christianity in the early Christian centuries, a very different form from contemporary Christianity, did not reincarnate in a Central European populace, but needed longer in their passage between death and a new birth than the Native American souls. These were souls who passed through physical existence at an earlier time than the latter-day Native Americans at the time of the European conquests of America. We're only going back as far as that period at present, and not considering the destiny of earlier Native American souls. Now, the souls who were incarnated in the early Christian centuries in Europe, and were present as Christianity was spreading north from southern regions, they tended to be drawn toward Asia when they reincarnated. What I'm describing was particularly apparent as the terrible catastrophe of the second decade of the 20th century approached. And in considering our contemporary civilization on earth, it seems of very great significance to see that such souls were incarnated amongst the Japanese people in particular. In other words, they were souls who had once experienced the distinctive kind of European Christianization I described, but who now heard no word of Christianity as they were growing up. Rising from their subconscious, however, were past Christian impulses that subtly colored a new decadent Asiatic culture and stood in opposition to modern Europe. Basically, what we have here, therefore, is a now entirely decadent Oriental wisdom, though it had once possessed the kind of grandeur I described, converging with early primitive Christian impulses that arose in Europe as Christianity spread amongst barbarian tribes. This was true of the great majority of the population. The matter is complicated, however, by the fact, remembering that the souls of the original, early indigenous American peoples and the Central Europeans both moved eastward, that the population arising in this way also possessed many individual bodies inhabited by souls who lived further south during the early Christian centuries. These two are now living amongst the population of which arose as I have described. Then, if we consider contemporary civilization, we find a great number of souls who lived in the centuries preceding the establishment of Christianity throughout Asia and in the Middle and Near East. This was, of course, no longer the great period of the blossoming of Oriental wisdom and culture, and yet it was a time when concepts and ideas developed that could later be employed to understand the mystery of Golgotha. I am speaking, therefore, of souls with no connection to the mystery of Golgotha, who nevertheless cultivated wisdom, which was then transplanted westward and, subsequently, enabled Greek and Roman culture to grasp the mystery of Golgotha. It is always necessary to distinguish between the mystery of Golgotha as a fact and the various ways it has been interpreted throughout the centuries. The reality of Golgotha can be interpreted anew by every age, and it would be nonsensical to identify any teaching about it with what actually occurred there. A comparison can clarify this. Imagine there's a very brilliant person, a genius, and then we have a child, and also an average kind of person who reduces things to their lowest denominator, a rather narrow-minded fellow, an average sort. And thirdly, another person who has a touch of genius about him too. All three see the brilliant genius in front of them. The child will find a childlike explanation for what the genius does. The Philistine, who likes to explain everything away, will have his own rationale. And the third person with a touch of genius will see things differently again. All three of them are considering one and the same reality, yet their explanations are quite different. It would be wrong to say that any of them had grasped the whole truth. Likewise, we cannot identify the doctrines of early Christian centuries with the reality of Christianity. These early Christian doctrines had come from the Orient. Oriental wisdom had informed people's understanding and explanation of the mystery of Golgotha. It is, of course, terribly tyrannical for the Church, as it developed, to insist that these doctrines were the only valid ones, for they are nothing more than the intrinsic nature of an era, projected onto the mystery of Golgotha to explain it. Other eras can explain it differently. It is our task to explain it in terms of spiritual science, in a way that accords with the needs of the present era. Thus, what lived in doctrines about the Christ impulse in the early centuries of Christianity, largely amongst the educated classes, and of course a great deal less amongst the majority of the population, is something we rediscover in the Orient, albeit no longer applied to Christianity, but more or less overlooking it. The Oriental souls who lived directly before and also during the mystery of Golgotha took a long time in their passage between death and a new birth, because Oriental culture, even in its more decadent forms, presented human souls with extraordinarily complex ideas. It is these souls who appear in particular in the population which slowly floods through America during the conquests of America by Europeans. The whole of American culture, with its materialistic coloring, largely arises because souls that were Oriental during the time I described brought their already very decadent concepts with them as they descended into bodies, insinuating themselves into these bodies, one might say, and experienced these bodies as alien, failing to understand their corporeality, but regarding it in a fairly primitive and materialistic way. They more or less overlook the human being, a human nature they are alienated from due to their cultivation of strong abstractions in their previous life, and bring with them from this past life everything which then lives in an often sectarian religiosity, sundered from outward observation of nature. We can see this even in the denial of matter propounded by Mrs. Eddy, the Christian Scientists, and so forth. Everything that emerged here in the external world can help verify what I say if one looks at things with a sufficiently open mind. As you see, we gain a full picture of reality if we enhance a merely external or empirical anthropology with insights gained through an anthroposophic science of the spirit. But we must give serious credence to such insights. It is not enough to rely on theoretical considerations alone, such as the idea of repeated incarnations. But we must use this idea practically in our observations of reality. And then these insights can gradually bear their fruits in the social domain, in practical life. People who cling to a worldview in which they consider only the external natural order, a merely anthropological outlook, in which physical inheritance from one generation to the next is the only factor, will inevitably find themselves facing increasing riddles. One can spend a long time dwelling in illusions about these riddles. One can think one understands something about humanity's evolution. But these illusions prevail because of theories inculcated into people from their earliest childhood. so that really they only have eyes for what comes to expression in genetically acquired traits. Gradually, though, people will come to see that some facts, which cannot be denied or ignored, cannot be explained at all by purely anthropological causes. It is important to realize that in any particular generation of any race or nation, souls are present who come from somewhere else entirely than from the ancient ancestors of this people. Nationalism might not take too kindly to this idea, but this nationalism or national egotism will have to fade if humanity is to evolve in the right way in future. It is important to see that a large proportion of the people of Europe, who do of course perpetuate the blood, the genetic traits of their medieval ancestors, nevertheless bear Native American souls in them, and that the souls who once lived here in Europe, the great majority of them at the time of Attila, and who adopted Christianity at that time, now live in Asia. Unprejudiced observation can discover this, for instance, in certain cultured souls. But we cannot engage with these truths in the linear, pedantic way people are accustomed to nowadays. If instead we avoid thinking in the abstraction so prevalent today, but seek to approach reality, the perspective adopted here is the kind to pursue. Then various things can be learned, which, though apparently paradoxical, do explain the reality we see before us. In the sometimes whimsical writings of Rabindranath Tagore, for example, it is rather remarkable to observe this distinctive nuance. One gets the tangible spiritual sense that his soul originates in Christianity, while his body comes from the Orient. This produces an Oriental whimsicality, and the warmly genial sense a European feels seeping into him when reading Tagore comes from a soul that once sailed into Christianity and has only not become a Christian in this incarnation because of living in an outwardly non-Christian culture. The ancient Greek saying, "Man, know thyself," is in fact not just directed at each individual, nor, above all, intended to cultivate some kind of trivial self-reflection, but is also directed at humanity as a whole. Humanity, however, usually does not take too kindly to pursuing such knowledge. But our civilization will not progress if we do not finally give serious attention, and the whole of humanity too, to this Apollonian saying, "Man, know thyself." It is a somewhat uncomfortable precept, perhaps. People such as Kurt Liess, for instance, whom I mentioned in public lectures in Basel, would consider this tiresome and irritating, to look beyond the human being, consisting merely of nose, mouth, and eyes, and examine the nature of the human soul. Yet, if we went on propounding mere phrases and abstractions about successive lives on earth, and the destiny thereby realized, but held back from applying such ideas to life itself, in fact, knowing nothing more about the human being than whether he has black or blonde hair, or this shape or that of eyebrows, or this or that kind of nose, how on earth could a spiritual worldview ever come to practical realization in humanity? If we are serious about disseminating a spiritual worldview in the world, then what we regard as, quote, knowledge of the human being, close quote, must also be permeated by impulses of spirit and soul. And we must not hold back from rigorous, uncomfortable exploration of the human soul, both our own and that of others. We must then examine not just a nose, but inner qualities. Humanity's progress in the near future will depend on looking less at outward forms of the nose and so forth, as on establishing interpersonal relations based on real insight into the soul. The so-called social question is something far deeper than numerous people nowadays believe. Basically, this social question cannot be broached at all, at one remove, by perpetuating a view of the human being I described to you at the end of the lecture yesterday, which utterly disregards human nature itself and speaks only of private property and its management, along with the economic mechanism. Having lost an instinctive grasp of the soul, and with it any capacity at all to understand the human being, society today engages only with the most superficial aspects of humanity. At the same time, this unleashes primal instincts, the wildest instincts. Humanity would succumb to a life of the wildest instincts if spirit and soul did not imbue our immediate human lives. To cultivate this, we need to see something other than just external historical causality, something that simply exists in our human reality on earth by virtue of the fact that descendants do not just embody the physical traits they have inherited from their ancestors, but also possess souls who lived at a previous period, at a particular time, and with particular soul spiritual characteristics. The reality of our human civilization today really does represent a convergence resulting from qualities of reincarnated souls with the physical traits passed on through generations. The initial backlash against a spiritual worldview comes to expression not just in the mechanistic and materialistic thinking of science, and not only in theoretical discourse, but in fact goes far deeper than this. It comes to expression, too, in aims to establish a world order without any regard for the spirit and soul, based solely on physical anthropological factors of genetic inheritance and so forth. The aim is to create a map of Europe entirely governed by national bloodline, by chauvinistic and nationalistic impulses. This is the pragmatic social backlash against the influx of a spiritual world order. One can put it like this: by adopting the propositions of Wilsonism, which aim at self-government by peoples physically related to each other, a declaration has been issued that, quote, "we want nothing to do with soul's spiritual impulses," close quote. This represents opposition to the influx of soul and spirit. This is not critique, but simply a description of the facts. What surfaces here is indeed a pragmatic, social, racial opposition to realization of the soul's spiritual realm. But as the soul and spirit come to imbue human outlooks, they will at the same time affect and encompass practical life, and this is urgently needed. It is essential and cannot come too soon enough to modern souls. Those who begin to understand these things, who start to grasp something of the practical importance of anthroposophically oriented spiritual science, and how the ideas of this science of the spirit can transform into living impulses governing human actions, must do all in their power, wherever possible, to counteract a merely anthropological outlook. Everywhere we can see today how anthropology, naturally understood in the broadest sense, is letting the world plunge into decline. Anthroposophy must preserve it from this downfall. Two currents exist at present in humanity's evolution, and will inevitably clash: the purely anthropological, which also informs political measures, albeit in many diverse ways, and the anthroposophical, which is still frowned upon today. There are signs everywhere of how contemporary people will inevitably develop to a point where they must form a strong inner resolve to come down on one side or the other. This is not something that can be decided in a little chamber of theories as a comfortable choice between worldviews, but must absolutely come to practical realization. And anyone who does not stay safely observing things from his anthroposophical ivory tower, seeing instead how the spirit's significance lies in spirit learning to master matter, learning to immerse itself in material things, so that even ordinary daily life can be seen in terms of the spirit, becomes the butt of particular derision. Humanity has to wake up I've often said this. It has to wake up and make courageous resolves. That is what humanity needs. In the subterranean depths of our so-called civilized humanity, however, very oppressive impulses are rooted. The contemporary world gives us plentiful opportunities to see how initially everything is dismissed that asks a person to inwardly resolve on anything. Let me read that again. The contemporary world gives us plentiful opportunities to see how initially everything is dismissed that asks a person to inwardly resolve on anything. There is no need to adopt a partisan stance simply because we introduce into daily life something that it certainly needs. The signature of our future evolution will be a developing capacity to observe from a higher standpoint what lies directly before us. A recent occurrence, in my view, really does illuminate the somnolent character of contemporary individuals. For many years now I have not held back from saying that the love of abstraction has turned a great proportion of humanity into ardent Wilsonites, and I have described the contemporary effects of this. And now, very recently, we have seen that the relatively small, yet certainly civilized nation of Hungary needed to take some decisions. An individual whose character may have been problematic in many respects was nevertheless asking the people of Hungary to wake up in a sense. And then we saw how this individual was ruled out of the picture through what I would call a true paradox, and the nation decided instead to appoint a nobody as its leader, a person who had proven himself to be quite worthless. These things relate to extremely mundane concerns, and yet it is precisely this that bothers one so much today, that such things are not seen as symptoms, but coldly overlooked, that people fail to discern the symptoms of decline in humanity, and the need to summon our powers, so that human souls wake up once more. It would be of real consequence for the civilized world to observe contemporary events with great inner attentiveness, to engage with what is at work here below the surface. It really is not the sign of a great mind to be majestically indifferent to the deep symptoms underlying current events. Outer events tell us what is at work beneath them. Ahrimanic powers pervade humanity at present, as I have said so often. We can see these powers at work in humankind by observing things with an open mind. But how can we get at the truth if we sleepwalk through things, if we look with indifference on historical events that offer us outward confirmation of what is truly at work, merely noting them superficially, in the way humanity has become accustomed to doing? The science of the Spirit has no wish to be partisan, but it must keep faith with and embody reality. We have to open our eyes today to the vigorous Ahrimanic powers opposing everything that invokes the Spirit. These times, naturally extending through years, will decide whether the Church Fathers were right to, quote, abolish the Spirit, close quote, at the 8th General Ecumenical Council in the year 869, whether this state of affairs will remain, or whether the Spirit will once again inform and enliven humanity's evolution. This will not happen through merely theoretical reflections, but only by integrating such ideas into practical life.